Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to Open Source Workplace Weekly Podcast. We're transitioning from a daily show to a weekly podcast, simply bandwidth, and hopefully we can continue to provide excellent value for you. So what do we do here at Open Source Workplace? Open Source Workplace brings you industry experts, thought leaders, and we have a conversation with them about what actually is going on in the local, or in the market, in the media at that moment in time, and we have a conversation around those things, get their thoughts. I'm excited today to have a very special guest who's returning. Open Source Workplace, we kind of rotate on a regular basis some serious thought leaders, so I'm happy to do that today. Get to who our guest is in a wee minute. Who am I? My name is Steve Todd. I'm Global Head of Workplace at NASDAQ. I'm also the founder of OpenSourceWorkplace.com. Open Source Workplace is a community for those who want to share information and knowledge all about workplace. So who is our guest today and what are we going to talk about? Today we're going to talk with Neil Usher. Neil is the Chief Workplace and Chief Strategist at GoSpace AI, and obviously he's the author of Elemental Workplace and Elemental Change. What we're going to talk about, the future workplace and the triple bottom line. Triple bottom line, that's an interesting concept: people, organization, and the planet. And sort of my big question to Neil is going to be, how do you optimize? So that's what we're going to dig into. So before further ado, let's welcome Neil to the show. Neil, welcome.
Hi, thanks. It's great to be back.
No, great to have you, mate. Great to have you. It's been a little while since we've chatted, and you've been busy in a number of fronts. Last we spoke, you just published your book, Elemental Change, and big news for GoSpace. But first, Elemental Change. How's all that coming along?
Yeah, it's going really well. Was delighted with the reaction before Christmas. It's been a little quiet since Christmas, I think, sort of fairly typical with the start of a year. But I'm sure everyone's just got their head buried in it and desperately waiting to ask me some questions. So if you have questions, then please fire away. But these things tend to sort of run for a fair while. And we've got the US launch coming up in the next few days as well. So hopefully there'll be some traction on your side of the pond too.
Absolutely. And whenever we're finished with this, I'll put links to where people can go and find and get access to the book. It is a great book, and we've also provided podcasts previously where we went through various elements of that book. But also, like, you're the Chief Strategist at GoSpace AI. Big news recently for GoSpace. So first off, what is GoSpace? So we basically can understand what that is, and then let's talk about the big news that was recently released.
So GoSpace is using artificial intelligence at its heart, is a dynamic occupancy planning tool. It's a cloud-based software application. Takes about 24 hours to set it up and helps you to create actionable scenarios in relation to how you allocate workspace. Particularly given the current circumstances that most organisations are in, I think it's perfectly placed really for sort of testing ideas, looking at different strategies, looking at different scenarios and solutions. And being able to demonstrate those really clearly and easily to the organisation's leadership.
And then your big news, big news.
Yeah, global agreement with JLL. So we're partnering with them, which is fantastic for us. Hopefully it's fantastic for them too. It's sort of really putting dynamic occupancy planning at the centre of most of these conversations. We're doing some sort of joint marketing, and there's a webinar coming up in a week's time, which will explain a little bit more about the nature of the partnership and where we think it's going to go. But we're really excited about it. It's great to be working with JLL on this.
Great. Well done, mate. Well done. That's a big win for you guys. So very happy for you. One of the things I always love talking with you, Neil, is you've operated within organizations. You've worked at Honeywell, Rio Tinto, Sky. You've worked for design build firms, and now you're working for an occupancy sensor company or AI tool, occupancy tool. So therefore you kind of have this full gambit of really this understanding. But then you also have this creative side where you're able to articulate a lot of the problems, issues, strategies that people can implement to actually help them go forward. And you proposed this future workplace triple bottom line in December of last year, and you put together a series of articles on that. I really want to touch base on that. So what is the triple bottom line when you think about the future workplace?
It's an idea that's probably, I think it's somewhere between 10 to 20 years old. I forget who first coined the expression. It's something at GoSpace that we've used as a sort of way of explaining what we do on a fairly regular basis, and something we've often talked about. But I think it's especially relevant now, and I'm seeing more and more people talk about it. But it's the idea that every decision we take and everything we do in respect to property in the workplace has to first satisfy the needs of people, the organisation, and the planet. And it's not easy to pitch an idea that is able to satisfy each of those equally. And so the sort of situation we end up in a lot of the time is making choices, making trade-offs, ensuring that what we do in respect of either people or the organisation doesn't necessarily harm our sustainable objectives. If we focus too heavily on sustainability, what does that do for our ability to work effectively in the workplace? What does it do to the organisation's bottom line financially? So, it actually what's going on in the middle of that triangle, if you like, is actually a really complex mix of issues and choices that we have to make. And I think one of the other sort of benefits of using the triple bottom line approach is it does help those in property workplace roles actually connect more meaningfully with the organisation's leadership. Because very often the choices that we're asking leaders to make against the triple bottom line are those that have a huge sort of resonance with the actual business itself. I think it's a tool that is actually an integrator within an organisation. It actually helps us to have a sensible and meaningful discussion with organisational leadership about property and workplace issues. And it shows that we're very sensitive to the organisation's strategy and what it actually wants to achieve. Because a lot of these decisions are not necessarily property or workplace decisions alone. They are actually business decisions. And that's where those choices and those trade-offs have to be made. Not in the sort of the head of real estate's office, but actually in the executive team of the organisation.
Yeah, and it's interesting you describe it as a triangle, because one of the things that sort of was going through my head as I was reading the concept and reading your content, Neil, was I look at people, I look at the organisation, and I look at the planet, and you describe it as a triangle, three corners, never the three shall meet. So how do you balance off those three elements? That's, it's something we want to get to as we sort of come to the end of this. How do you optimize that? But it's interesting you describe it as a triangle, because that's where my head was. And you captured me right away from your opening statement, where you went through, okay, what are these aspirations that we want to have? And I want to run through some of these aspirations to get your perspective on it. And, you talk about exercise of free choice, the employee having a free choice. Do you think that's, achievable? Do you think that's reasonable?
It's become one of the sort of features, I think, of workplace conversations during lockdown. Is choice will be everything, and choice is one of the 12 elements in the original sort of Elemental Workplace book as well. And so I've talked about it quite a bit, but I think choice has to exist within the context that we're required to operate within. And there are going to be some organisational considerations, and there are going to be some sustainability considerations as well. If we're only expecting people to be in the office 2 or 3 days a week, as seems to be the sort of the general conclusion at this stage, how long that will last, we will see. But if that's what we're expecting, and we were already in a situation where most office buildings were, give or take, 50% unoccupied at any point in time, then we're automatically going to be expecting to see a much lower level of utilisation of space and lower level of attendance. And if the whole purpose of the workplace is to enable face-to-face interaction and that sort of ability for us to work together, we're going to have to know that the people we need to work with are actually going to be there at the same time as us. So free choice needs to be exercised not just individually, but in teams and in groups, because we don't work alone. We all work in teams to some degree or other. And if we're all exercising that choice as groups, or we're exercising that choice sometimes as individuals, and we're only going to be in the office 2 or 3 days a week, then really, is that a sustainable workplace proposition for the organisation? Is it a sustainable workplace operation for the planet as well? And it's highly likely that it's not particularly suitable for either. Organisations are going to be providing far more space than they're going to be bearing that cost. And from a sustainable point of view, we're going to be occupying far more space than we need to be occupying. So our whole city centres are going to be seriously underoccupied, and all of those buildings are going to be, environmentally, emitting greenhouse gases. So, how do we contain all of that, but still give people choice, but still make sure that choice is being exercised in a responsible way? So it means that choice does, to a degree, have to be constrained. It's not just free open choice of wherever you want to work on any particular day. We have to think about our colleagues. We have to think about the people we need to work with. Are they going to be in a similar place? Then we have to think about the organisation that's providing that space and think about the planet that it exists on.
Yeah, and I mean, you've sat in those rooms with executives at Honeywell, Sky, Rio Tinto. I've sat with executives, with NASDAQ and other organizations, and I have to imagine the thought of that freedom being given to employees must scare the life out of an executive team. How do you reconcile that?
Um, I think there's probably a sort of a greater awareness overall that the views of employees matter. And I don't think that's anything negative in that at all. Because I think that the ultimate sort of position for us to be in moving forward is to have a much more experimental mindset. Are we going to get this right first time out of the traps when we're allowed to sort of start reoccupying cities and start reoccupying space? Probably not. So we need to have this iterative, adaptive, experimental mindset, which means we have to have an open communication loop. And something that most organisations have had to work particularly hard at in the last 12 months is openly communicating with their people, and actually probably with some organisations for the first time actually listening. So that voice of our colleagues is going to be absolutely vital in the future. So as we try things in the workplace, as we experiment, as we make those changes, we need to hear the feedback. We need to know if they've been successful. That's the essence of what we call perpetual beta. It's co-design, effectively. It's making sure that we are constantly evolving the product, which is the workplace, that we are in an experimental situation. We are listening to the experience of the consumers of that workspace, what's working, what's not working, what's needed, and continually evolving that and continually improving it as we go. And we'll make mistakes. And if we make mistakes, we need to know about it. And we need to make sure we don't have to wait another 10 years for another fit out until we can rectify it and improve it. So I think that's where this is all moving. And I think that's incredibly positive. But for those leaders who might be a little bit fearful of almost unlimited employee choice, I think the important thing to establish very firmly, very quickly at the outset is an effective dialogue.
Yeah, it is. And sort of, the genesis of that question for me was more of what I feel I'm reading a lot of narrative on is the employee centric, and is there a bias towards the future work of employees and not necessarily the organization? Do you feel that, or do you think that's just LinkedIn and other algorithms giving me what they think I want to read rather than maybe what I should be reading?
I think there's a bit of that. I think we hear a lot more from commentators on the workplace rather than those who are actually managing workplaces. I think there is still, we talked about sort of open feedback and open communication loops. I think within the sort of community of practice of people who are actually managing workplace and dealing with a lot of these challenges, we don't often hear that side of the sort of supply-demand divide, if you like, and we've always needed to hear more of that. I think probably in the almost 30 years I've been in this business, it's been an issue for all time. And I think a lot of the time people are either too ridiculously busy, or they're a little wary sometimes perhaps of sort of contravening any sort of external communication protocols or policies. It's to start being sort of very outspoken about our industry and where it's headed and where sort of workplace thinking is headed. Very often requires some permission and some okay to do that from within an organisation. Whereas on the supply side, it's expected as part of branding and as part of sort of appearing to be knowledgeable and appearing to be up with trends and people who can help you through the near future. So we have two very different landscapes, I think, from sort of offering views and offering perspectives. And as far as I can ever remember, it's always been entirely lopsided. So we do have to remember that a lot of what we're hearing is from those people who would actually like things to change. It's just an inherent part of the way that sort of material and content is generated and thinking is generated in workplace circles.
Yeah, and sort of turning a little bit to productivity, you talk about dual notions of productivity, and as we all evaluate, how each of us felt productive or didn't feel productive in an office environment, how we feel productive or not productive today. it's kind of interesting. There's a feeling and there's subjective and objective, as you say. So actually, how productive are we against the organization's measurements, as opposed to rather than subjective and how we feel. I mean, my experience, the conversations I've been having, the way I value it, even myself, is what I've noticed is a lot of things that were routine, not adding value, have been eliminated from a lot of work processes. But the perception of how productive I'm feeling, how productive people I speak with are feeling, they feel much more productive. I want to say something like 70%, I would say feel more productive at home. So with this conflict of feeling productive, being productive against the measurement of what the organization feel, which do you feel is the most important?
I think it's a balance between the two. As with many things in workplace, it really always comes down to balance. I think one of the interesting things right now, though, is that for many years, organisations have wanted their people to work together more, probably forever, wanted their people to work together more. And yet, when we think about our sort of pre-COVID practices in the workplace, what was the single biggest issue every time a survey was done with people's dissatisfaction with the workplace? It was noise and disturbance. That's because we were attending the workplace every day of the week. We were expected to do everything in that workplace every day of the week. And so all of that sort of focus work that that most surveys have revealed is around about half of the time we spend in the workplace. We're trying to find some space. We're trying to find somewhere to focus, some peace and quiet. We're in open workspaces. So we have these things on, or probably sort of more powerful versions of these things in terms of noise cancellation, because we want to be able to get on with some work. But actually, what's quite interesting now, I think, is that because we've been absent from the workplace, we've also understood as individuals that actually, the real benefit of being in the workplace is to work together. It's that face-to-face interaction with our colleagues. We want to go back to the office to do the things that we can't do at home, or we find more restrictive at home. Doesn't mean to say we can't do them. We found ways around that, but it's much easier when we're in that sort of face-to-face situation. So probably for the first time ever, the needs of individuals and the needs of the organisation related to the workplace are actually aligned. We all recognise and understand now that we need to work together, and the workplace is a good place to do that, as good as any. And there are certain benefits of face-to-face interaction for certain tasks, and the physical workplace is the place to do it. So I think we'll see a lot less sort of issue being raised in relation to noise and disturbance and those types of issues in the workplace in the future, because we'll be understanding that it's actually the organisation's measure of productivity that we're pursuing in the workplace when we're working together, when we're working face to face. And then we'll probably feel a little bit more sensitive when we're at home or in a local space to our own as to how productive we feel. And I think we're actually heading to a position where if we can get this right, the balance between subjective and objective productivity is almost within sight, really. I think we can start to understand that landscape, just as we understand the landscape in relation to sort of working in a distributed fashion and working in a physical workplace together.
Yeah, and I think the goal is to aspire is to make sure the subjective and the objective productivity lines are running on the same tracks, right? Yeah, that's exactly where you want to get to. So it's how do we align those different things? And then talking about well-being in the context of employee choice and well-being, which one do you think is more important?
I think the well-being comes with the choice, really. I think that a lot of sort of what we resolve in relation to employee well-being is having some degree of autonomy and some degree of control. If a situation we are in we find counter to our well-being, we have the ability to exercise choice to take ourselves to another situation, whether that's a physical place or whether that's actually what we're doing. Some autonomy and some control over our day-to-day schedule is vital for that. If we feel that everything we have to do and everywhere we have to be is entirely dictated to us, it's going to cause levels of stress and it's going to cause some levels of dissatisfaction that impact on our well-being. But I think we have to remember with employee well-being that the vast majority of issues with well-being, or on the other hand, the positive contribution that can be made to employee well-being are people-related issues. They're not to do with the physical workplace. They're not to do with, we don't lie awake at night, not getting any sleep, worrying about the balance between primary and secondary work settings in the office. What we lay awake at night worrying about is someone something said, someone something did or didn't do, or didn't say. It's people interactions that very often make the biggest difference to our perception and our sense of well-being in the workplace. If what's come out of COVID is a greater appreciation of the value of being in each other's company, the value of being in each other's presence, the value of working together in a team, then that's going to make a massive contribution to our sort of sense of positive well-being in the workplace. And I've always come back to the sort of notion that came out of the first Bill and Ted film, that we can solve the majority of these problems in relation to well-being by just being excellent to each other. If we are just better to one another, if we're more decent, respectful, trusting towards one another, we resolve a huge amount of what causes stress and causes discomfort in the workplace. Yes, if we create physical workplaces, we can make sure that there's sufficient oxygen in the air and fresh air changes and all those sorts of things that actually make the atmosphere more pleasant. We can provide the sorts of amenities that enable social contact and social capital to be created in an organisation. We can do all those sorts of things, and they all help. I'm not suggesting for a minute we don't do that. Absolutely, we have to still focus on that because that's in our gift to do so. But we also have to recognise that actually what we're striving towards is primarily a better world of work, which then enables a better workplace.
So talking about that workplace, you talk about the difference between people-centric and organizational focused workplaces. So what is the difference and what's the best?
Balance, again, I think it's the balance between the people-centric, the organizational-centric, and the environmentally-centric workplace. It's back to that sort of triangle again. And I don't know why, but I do love a geometric shape, so I just naturally drew it as a triangle. But incredibly stable shape. I usually work with triangles and hexagons, both of which are inherently stable. So there's something about that. And you sort of said they would never meet, but actually the useful thing about a triangle is that they are all connected. And somewhere in the middle, I think there is that balance. And I think that the workplace needs to, fundamentally, they're for human beings. I described it yesterday as our investment in all of this and our investment in thinking and creation of workplaces is sort of a return on humanity rather than a return on investment. If we humanise the workplace, we do all get something back from that. So this sort of return on humanity has got to be sort of at the top of the list. So I think that of those three elements, the triple bottom line, people centricity comes first. But we do have to recognise that there is this context that we're operating in every single time. There'll be a number of organisations who have really suffered during this period of time. They've been decent to their people, they've been responsible brands, yet their industry potentially has suffered. They've lost business, they've lost revenue, and those organisations will have to make very different choices from some of those who've actually benefited from the COVID period or haven't suffered at all. And if they're open and honest about the choices they're making and the decisions they're taking, then I'm sure their people will understand that if they're being decent to them. So I think at the moment it's not just we have to be aware that it's as those who have been sort of for the last year prevented from being in our workplace, and we've had a lot of thought around what people-centric workplace means. That's all been fantastic sort of time well spent really in understanding all of that. But organisations will have experienced COVID incredibly differently and all have very different agendas and very different pressures and priorities coming out of this period of time. And actually, all the time this has been going on, the planet's had a bit of a breather in some respects. When you look at all of those sort of pollution maps, it's quite extraordinary how much some of that some of that pollution has actually died down. But it's going to return. And if anything, the climate crisis has been almost a little on hold while we've been focused on the pandemic, but it's still very much there and it's going to come again and it's going to be more serious this time around than ever before. So we absolutely can't forget that environmental context we're operating into.
Yeah, it is, and I'm glad you went into the sustainability and the environment because that's exactly where I was going to go next. And I wanted to go back to utilization and occupancy because you paint this picture that actually while I thought of it, I never really took into consideration the real impact of an underutilized office. You paint the picture in London, 300 million square feet of office space, 400 million of office space in New York City alone. So you just take those two locations. We operate at less than 50-60% is whenever we're utilized within an office environment. That's out of 5 days a week out of only how many hours in a day. So actually, what percentage of waste and carbon emissions are we actually eliminating, are causing? So again, whenever we try and think about the opportunity that is here, offset with the fact that if people are working remote, things need to be shipped to individuals. There's obviously a carbon footprint related to that. So how do we balance those elements and think about those elements going forward now?
I mean, it's one of the things that just really struck me. And the reason it struck me was because I was working with an organisation who had shift patterns, and they were actually getting usage from their estate over a 24-hour period rather than just looking at it on a typical working day. But if you take the sort of levels of utilisation we're commonly used to accepting, because we have been accepting, or most organisations have just taken that as being sort of the norm, if you like. And then we look at the amount of availability over 7 days and 24 hours that a building potentially offers, then realistically, we're actually generally in a normal CBD, we are occupying physical workspace for 15% of its available capacity, 1.5. If you can imagine some further exercise of free choice and some sort of, some adjusted periods of attendance, 2-3 days a week, then we're probably going to be sub 10% by the time that kicks in most existing workplaces. Now, I don't think there's another asset that organisations would procure or take on or sustain in any way at all where they would accept that level of contribution, given the expenditure that they're making and the commitment they're making to it. Imagine if we applied that sort of metric to people. If we expected them to be productive for 10 to 15% of their time, the rest of the time, don't worry about it. Go and do something more interesting. That's fine. We're okay with 10 to 15%. It's great. You've done a really good job this year. It's just not going to happen. So why do we do that with property? Why do we do that with the workplace? Why do we accept that 15% is actually okay? A lot of it is probably because, despite sort of attempts to actually bring this to sort of leadership attention all the time, it wasn't necessarily regarded as important, or it wasn't something that wanted to be faced, or potentially the upshot of the alternative strategies that we could deploy, on balance, weighing it all up, leadership would rather not pursue them because the potential negative effects of those strategies might have actually cost the organisation more in the long run in relation to performance or productivity. But these are really important choices, and in relation to sustainability, in relation to the environment, they're choices that we have to start being aware of and have to start making. And more than anything, really, we need to call waste out for what it is. It's only recently that we've actually started to use the expression waste to relate to empty workplace. It was just sort of, ebb and flow, or just the natural order of things, or the way the workplace worked. It's not. It's been waste, and it's been waste for the whole time that I've been in this business. And we've been collecting utilisation data in workplaces for 30 years, probably more, certainly at least on an active level, 20 years. And there are very few exceptions to those patterns of occupancy. Most of the graphs that I've ever seen have a very similar shape and operate at a very similar level. It's different in some industries and it's different in some countries because cultures work in different ways, and I accept that. But generally speaking, in the most condensed city centres, such as London and New York, as you've suggested, in those condensed city centres, that level of utilisation is a typical position on a day-to-day basis. That is waste.
So Neil, you're sitting back in your day jobs, whether you're sitting at Sky, whether you're sitting at Honeywell or Rio Tinto, and you're looking at this and you've got to give advice to your executive team, and you know what this utilization is, and executives go, how do we bring employees back? How do we design that optimal space? What advice, what guidance would you give them today? I
think a lot of what we're going to be doing going forward with organisations is presenting choices. There is, I've just wrapping up a piece of workplace strategy work we've been doing since Christmas, and I was having a discussion with the client and say, look at it, if we would go back 18 months, this report would have looked very different. We'd have been very sure of what the recommendations are. What we're doing here now is we're presenting in as open and transparent a way a series of options and a series of paths, and there's a lot of dependencies out there where we don't have perfect information. It's something of a sort of decision tree almost. The future is panning out in front of us in this way. So we have to be really open and transparent about those options, open about the advantages and disadvantages of each, be really clear about where we have information that will help us make that decision or the information that's missing, because these are business-related decisions. They involve a lot of money and a lot of sort of time to execute, and they will impact just about everybody in the workplace. But the good thing is, as I suggested at the outset, is that is potentially bringing these teams closer to the heart of the business and heart of business decision making. A lot of sort of real estate property decisions pre-COVID were quite remote from where the business strategy was being formulated. A lot of real estate teams were some of the last people to be informed of what the business wanted to do, or sort of merger activity, all that sort of thing. I'm hoping really that this is getting real estate teams much closer to the heart of the organisation, to where those decisions are being made, to being really clear about the impact of those choices that lie ahead. And as I suggested, I think a lot of this will be about experimentation, it will be evolution, it will be adaptation. But this is also a really fantastic opportunity, I think, for some really clear thinking. While we're in this situation, in the past it was always just we were just firefighting, trying to keep up with events. We have an opportunity now to say to the leadership of organisations, tell us what your business challenges are. Tell us what you need solved, and we will find property and workplace solutions to solve those challenges that you're facing. We don't need executives to tell us which floors to evacuate and what to do with the portfolio of buildings. What we need executives of an organisation to do is explain the business strategy, tell us where they want to get to, and leave it for real estate teams to be the enablers of that strategy and to contribute in that way and to solve those problems, solve those challenges, present options, be really transparent about it. And be in that dialogue loop. I talked about dialogue loops earlier with our colleagues who are inhabiting space. It's important to have that dialogue loop with those who are making decisions within the organisation as well, because they will need to understand the need for this experimental mindset, and the fact that this isn't the case as it was pre-COVID, where we just set out a path and we say, shall we go and do this? Yes, let's go and do it. And it's very nicely sort of set out with phase gates, and it's a critical path with key dependencies, and we know exactly what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen. So we need to have this flexible, experimental approach, and we need to have that dialogue with those who are making decisions in the business and with all of our colleagues who are actually occupying the space. And if we get that right, I think we're in just the position.
No, I love that answer, and again, I always go back to the executives, the strength, the courage that they must require to operate in that experimental time frame. It must be tough for them to sort of work through. But we did get a question from Dan Van Rossum. Dan, thank you, appreciate it. I know you're a regular watcher. So interesting commented versus those actually managing workplaces. What are the biggest misunderstandings, theory versus practice? What do you think, Neil? I know.
I think it's the idea of the activity-based workplace. I think theoretically it's a lovely idea. I think this this notion of people making free choice, moving between settings, being highly mobile. Actually, at the end of the day, most of the activity that we can perform in a workplace can be performed in and around a desk or in and around another setting. I think the whole idea of the activity-based workplace is overplayed as a concept. All of the sort of credible research that I've read that has evaluated the success or otherwise of activity-based workplaces suggests that two criteria need to be met for them to be successful. One is that people have a complex day job. They have a range of activities that they will need to perform that differ quite extensively. And the second one, I think, which is really fascinating as a sort of upshot of this research, is that people will have to show an interest in the underlying philosophy of the workplace and actually be sort of aware of what that is. And actually, most of the time, no one's got time for that. Most of the people that we provide a workplace for need it to be intuitive, they need it to be easy to navigate, they need it to be responsive, they need to know how to get things done, where to get things done. They just want it to sort of basically work and then actually get out of the way and let them do their jobs. That's what people are looking for in the main from our workplace. we've expected, I think, because we're interested in the underlying philosophy of the workplace, that somehow it's got to be an interesting subject, and everybody in the workplace has got to be interested in it too. And most of the time, they're not. Most of the time, people don't have the sort of complex roles that the sort of originators of ABW envisaged. And I think they envisage roles becoming more complex in time. But what's happened is we've actually broken those roles down, so their level of complexity has remained fairly constant. And I think they also envisage that we've envisaged that everybody will be really excited about an underlying philosophy or concept of the workplace, and that just doesn't happen. So I think really that's the biggest divide that I see between theory and practice, is that certainly I've created enough sort of supposedly agile or activity-based workplaces in my career, and I see the same sort of behavioural responses in those. But they don't fail, they don't fall over. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the way people navigate their way through them, but it doesn't match the theory.
Interesting. We're going to have to pull in that thread another time, Neil, because I do have some comments, and perhaps we should get you on with maybe a Luke Camperman or something and have a deep conversation on some of these theories and practices, because I think it would be a good conversation. But before we wrap up, I do want to go back and circle back to that first question where we talked about, that with the three elements, the bottom line, what is the answer? How do we optimize those in one paragraph, Neil? How do we?
I think we have to be aware of the opportunities of each and the constraints of each, and we have to be particularly aware of and sensitive to the interrelationship between the three. So we have to be able to trace a decision in one and its impact on the other, and be open to that, sensitive to it, and not try and pretend that it doesn't exist. And we're quite good at that in our field, of sort of making a decision and then assuming that everything else will sort of somehow right itself. It's retaining that mindset. It's having that triangle in your mind every time you develop an idea and you make a decision. It's being able to evaluate it against each one of those three, evaluate where the opportunities are, evaluate where the risks are, and where those dependencies will potentially negatively affect the other. Because it's very, very difficult to get an idea or a strategy that absolutely meets the sort of the needs or requirements of each simultaneously. There are always going to be choices, always going to be trade-offs. But it's a fantastic tool for helping us to think those things through. And really, they are the three broad characteristics that we need to keep in our mind. So I would urge everybody to try it. If you haven't used it before, it's worth giving it a go in relation to any of the strategies you're pursuing or considering.
Great. Neil, as always, it's great chatting with you. I always open with my mind. I appreciate everything you do, everything you write, everything you share. Your voice, as I said, that I listen to regularly, so I appreciate it. Before we wrap up, how do people reach out to you? What's the best way to keep in contact and follow you, Neil?
The usual sort of channels these days, really. LinkedIn tends to be where I post these days the most. Work Essence was around for 10 years, but it's not up anymore. So I tend to post on LinkedIn or Medium. You can find me on Twitter at Work Essence. And there's always a healthy debate going on both channels. So
yes, there is. There always is. There's always some wit, some sarcasm, and even the odd bit on QPR as well. So I do encourage people to go follow Neil. Neil, as always, thank you, man. I appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Thanks ever so much, Steve.
Thanks everybody. Thanks everyone for watching.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.